The Israelites said to Gideon, so sometime after all this fighting is over, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian." So they want a king. So now they have gotten to the point where they realize that they need central leadership to take care of their problems. This way they're going about it right now, of having basically every man for himself, every tribe for itself, is not working. So now they want a king. They're starting to get the thought in their minds that they need a king. They have a king. That king is supposed to be God, but that's just not good enough for them. So they want a man as king. And this is the first time we've heard them offer that role to somebody. But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." So Gideon at least knew that the Lord was supposed to be their king. Now, he's going to act like a king. He formally rejects their offer of being made king, but he's going to act as though he is king. And he said, "I do have one request. Each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. Now, we had just got done calling these guys Midianites. Apparently, they had intermarried with the Ishmaelites enough that they were essentially the same people group, at least to a certain degree. Now, this goes back to the golden calf incident in Exodus. So right away, we know that we're in for trouble. Exodus 32, starting at the beginning of the chapter. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, remember, he was up there for 40 days, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. Ask this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt. We don't know what happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, or your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." So right away, we're hearkening back to that incident when he talks about giving me your earrings. So we know that what's going to happen up next is not going to be a good thing. You know, when I finished reading through Deuteronomy and then Joshua, I said that everything that happens after these books are going to build on what was written in these, okay? And that's true. You know, I think even as I've been reading through Judges, Job is kind of its own thing. I read that. But even as I've been reading Judges now, more so than I have before, I've been going back and referencing and reading out passages from earlier in the Bible to help explain or illuminate certain things about this book. And that's going to become going forward. Okay, that's going to happen more and more as time goes on, because everything that happens in the rest of the Bible comes out of the works of Moses, and also Joshua is kind of like an epilogue to that. So get used to that. So here's a story that is when this would have been, I don't know who finished the book of Judges. I don't know how this book came into its form that we have it today, or when. I don't know when that happened. These stories would have been told at some point. They would have been written down at some point. They would have been read out loud to people at some point. Unlike with Moses. You know, when I read through the works of Moses, like I say, think of yourself as in a crowd, as one of the men in that crowd of Israelites, or Hebrews, who were in the crowd listening to Moses read this out loud after he finishes writing it and comes out of his tent and starts reading it to you. I can't say that with Judges. I don't know who would have first heard this. I mean, these stories would have been told over by mouth over time until somebody wrote them down. But I don't know who that person was or who would have been the original hearers of it. But I do know that whoever it was came after Moses, and his audience would have come after Moses, and they would have all been familiar with what Moses wrote. You know, I said about Gideon. Gideon knows who Jehovah is. His dad despite being a Baal worshiper, knew who Jehovah was. These Israelites knew Jehovah. They knew about Yahweh. They would not have agreed with the prophets who wrote this stuff down from the perspective of God, that they had abandoned their Lord, their God, or hey, they had forgotten. They would not have agreed with that because they thought that they didn't think they were doing that. By worshiping these Baals and these Asherahs, in addition to Jehovah, the prophets and God said that they had forgotten their God. But they wouldn't have thought that way. They would have thought that they would have not seen themselves as forgetting God just because they're also worshiping these other gods. They knew about Jehovah. They knew about God. Gideon had heard about the stories of God. So at this point, everything that we read after the works of Moses, we have to assume that the people who wrote it down, and all the people who would have heard it originally, would have been familiar with at least the works of Moses. Maybe not with the other books. As these books get added, they're going to add more to their canon, to their scriptures. But they're all going to be familiar. They may or may not be familiar with other parts of the Bible later on. But they're all going to be familiar with Moses. And the New Testament will be familiar with all of it, of course. But from here on, everything that we read is going to be rooted in what Moses wrote. And Joshua, at the end of Joshua. Joshua is basically the epilogue to Moses. It's about them taking the land and settling it and then divvying up the inheritances. And so everything that we read after that comes from that, grows out of that. So the author of this work knows that his readers, he knew about the calf incident in Exodus, and he knew that his readers know about that incident. So right away, we're drawing from something we're familiar with from the works of Moses and setting the stage here for an idolatrous episode that will harm Israel. So they answered, "We'll be glad to give them." They spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. What is an ephod? Well, I don't know exactly what an ephod is, but the other time we read about an ephod is from the description of the high priest garment in the works of Moses, Exodus. The high priest wore something called an ephod around his shoulders and chest. I don't know exactly what this thing was, but it is some kind of a garment worn by a priest. I'm assuming that's what we're talking about here, a garment that someone claiming the title of priest is wearing. So Gideon has made an ephod, apparently is wearing it, or somebody is wearing it, and acting like a priest. So they are prostituting themselves in front of this make-believe priest, who is wearing this made-up ephod, and apparently trying to conduct himself like he's some kind of a priest. He formally refused the title of king, but apparently he has taken it upon himself to act as Israel's priest. And so it's become a snare to Gideon and to his family, and all Israel has prostituted themselves because of this thing. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and did not raise its head again. We're not going to really read about the Midianites again. The Philistines are going to be around. The Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites are going to still be around, but the Midianites are basically gone. During Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace for 40 years. If Midian is still around, and if they're still nomads, they're going to be going to other places to get their food. They're not going to be raiding Israel again. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech, which means my father is king. So Gideon is essentially acting like a king here, even if he did not officially accept the title of king. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god, and they did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Again, they probably would have said they did remember, but according to the prophet, according to God, according to the writer of this book, writing from the perspective of God, they did not. They also failed to show kindness to the family of Jerubbaal, that is, Gideon, for all the good things he had done for them. Let's read about the king. According to Moses. Moses, of course, lived many years before Israel had an official king. He also lived many years before Gideon started acting like a king, even though he wasn't technically a king. In Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14, it says this: When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, which they have by Gideon's time, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. They haven't technically done that yet, although they basically offered Gideon that role, and he said no. Formally said no. He effectively acted like a king, despite officially saying no. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Now, they didn't do that with Gideon. There's no indication anywhere that the Lord had chosen Gideon to be king. The people asked Gideon that of their own volition. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israel. Well, that's not a problem, at least. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. Here's the thing about Gideon. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Gideon has done both of those things. Gideon had 70 wives of his own, 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. We also read about all the stuff he got. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels. And that doesn't count the ornaments, pendants, and purple garments, which apparently they gave him those too. So Gideon, although he's not officially a king, is acting like a king and is doing some of the things that kings are not supposed to do. Moreover, he has set up an ephod for himself, apparently effectively installing himself as a new kind of priest, which is definitely not what the king was supposed to do. And he's not of the royal lineage, he's not of the proper lineage of priests anyway. So his priesthood was a false one. It was a snare to himself and to his family and to all the country of Israel. And in fact, his legacy is going to end up resulting in a civil war that breaks out between the Israelites when his son Abimelech, which means my father is king, comes to the throne, comes to the position of leadership over at least a portion of Israel, and ends up having negative consequences for everyone involved. And we'll read about that next time. So Gideon, in other words, Gideon is not a great guy. Okay? There is a lot more bad than good when it comes to Gideon. Gideon, on the balance, on the whole, is someone that we should look at as a negative example for the most part. Yes, he had his moments. Yes, he did ultimately follow God into battle with 300 men against 100,000. But in the end, his legacy is actually a very dark one. And I think we need to be aware of that. I think a lot of times, again, as I said before, The idea of leading a small ragtag bunch of misfits into battle against an overwhelming force just really speaks to a certain mindset, which is very common among preachers and teachers. Like it not only is it a certain mindset, but it's one that many of those kinds of people have. Okay, it's like that's, a lot of the people who get into ministry as preachers or teachers or pastors have that kind of mindset. It's like there is a large overlap. Not everybody does, but there is a large overlap. I don't have that mindset. Like I'm not a warrior. I'm not going to pretend that I am. Okay, if I had been there at all, I would have been one of the guys who fled when he was given permission to flee. Okay, that's what I am. I'm not gonna pretend that I'm anything other than that. And that's assuming I've even been there. I might have found an excuse to not even go in the first place. Okay, it's like I'm going to freely admit that I'm not cut out for that sort of thing. I never have been, never will be, and I'm not gonna say anything other than that. But I do find this mindset, this attitude, in a lot of dudes. And in particular, they tend to be in the same kinds of people who get into these sorts of ministry positions. I've read lots of books, read lots of lessons, read lots of sermons, all about Gideon, and they tend to be very, very, very praiseworthy. I think in the end, just because they like that sort of underdog battle story. But the story of Gideon's legacy on the whole is actually a very negative one, a very dark one. We're going to read about it in the next chapter, with his immediate legacy being a civil war between one of his sons and the rest of the Israelites. And overall, he led them further into idolatry than they were before, even. And the conditions in Israel are going to be decidedly worse after Gideon than they were before. So yes, he had his moments. He is mentioned in Hebrews 11. His name is mentioned in the list. But overall, he is not a great guy. He is not a great role model, and is not someone that we should really strive to be like very much. Which is ultimately true for just about everybody in the book of Judges. Because in the end, this is actually really a book of bad examples, not good ones.